were discovered off the coast of Mozambique about a decade ago. It was, at the time, a beacon of hope for a country not only struggling with crushing poverty, but also a plague of crippling natural disasters like cyclones, floods, and drought. Now, all of that promise, all of that hope in jeopardy. There are billions of dollars on the line, and Mozambique has a huge challenge ahead in securing the area enough to lure back Total, as well as its own people who have fled as refugees after the brutal violence. I want to bring in Energy and Infrastructure Specialist Rolake Akinkugbe-Filani. She is the Chief Commercial Officer of Mixta Africa. Rolake, thank you so much for being with us. So this was a huge investment in Mozambique. It was supposed to generate about $100 billion over the course of 25 years. And honestly, you and I both know that in these situations, you never really know if that money is going to trickle down to ordinary citizens. However, the government had promised key investments in health, in education, in infrastructure. What hangs in the balance for Mozambique economically, do you think?
Thanks, Zain. Great to be here. I think it's safe to say Mozambique's entire economic future hangs in the balance. You mentioned $100 billion in revenue over the next 25 years expected from this major LNG project. And to put that into context, that's about roughly 6 times the country's GDP. Right? So it's really a very critical situation. And then if you look beyond that, the IMF had forecast growth for this year in Mozambique originally at 3.8%. It's been forced to revise that down to about 2%. There's about $2.5 billion worth of contracts that would have gone to local Mozambican companies. We've also heard from an economic association in the country that SMEs have lost about $90 million in revenues and turnover since these attacks escalated in January. So there is a huge amount of investment that is hanging in the balance. And it's not just Total that has suspended work. Obviously, other oil and gas companies will be watching very closely. And I think there is a real concern from both the local and international community about the country's future.
Yeah, I mean, just speaking about international community, not just international as in overseas, but regionally in southern Africa. I mean, you know, these natural gas projects were, yes, exports, but they were also going to be exported regionally. Natural gas was going to be exported to neighboring countries around Mozambique, as well as used for power within Mozambique itself. So what's at stake regionally for some of Mozambique's neighbors in all of this?
Well, regionally, for neighbors, let's start with its neighbor to the north, Tanzania. Tanzania obviously has its own huge gas resources, and there was a pipeline project in the works between both countries. That's now being key basins for gas discoveries. Rovuma sits on the frontier between both economies. Then if you look at the fact that historically, Mozambique has had a gas pipeline that goes to South Africa, it's no wonder that SADC, the regional organization in Southern Africa, is coming together, not just to look at supporting the Mozambican army in terms of training to quell the insurgency, but is now thinking about a regional intervention force. And I think that just highlights the high-stakes game that this conflict is gradually becoming, because the economic prosperity of that entire axis, it's along the coast, it is close to port access in other climes, is hanging in the balance.
And Rolake, it's important, I mean, yes, we talk about dollars and we talk about money, but of course that's only I would say a small part of the story, because the real story here is the humanitarian crisis. You're dealing with at least over 2,000 people. Since the insurgency began, by the way, from ISIS in 2017, you're dealing with 2,000 people who have been killed. You're also looking at 700,000 people fleeing their homes, being completely displaced, refugees entering into parts of Malawi, for example, other countries in the neighboring area that are already struggling under the weight of refugees. So what is at stake for this country just humanitarianly and just in terms of keeping its own citizens safe?
Well, you know, internally, we know more than 700,000 have been displaced. So you already have an IDP crisis and a refugee crisis, which will most likely spill over broadly beyond Malawi and Tanzania. Beyond that, you just have the fact that even foreign workers and domestic workers have been evacuated from site. You've also had a situation where you've had an ensuing battles that have raged for up to 12 days at a time, which raises questions about whether the local security services are able to quell this conflict. And if you look at what has happened in other African countries who have huge natural oil and gas resources, we look at countries like Nigeria, like Angola, like the DRC, we look at some of the terrorism problems we had in the Sahel region in West Africa. What we do know is what may start as a localized conflict can quickly escalate beyond the country's borders and can spill over not just into a humanitarian crisis across the entire East Africa or Southern Africa region, but frankly, one in which I think even Pan-African bodies like the AU will eventually have to intervene in to avoid any further damage to the country's economic future, but also human rights. And one of the things I want to mention is what typically happens in response to this crisis is that some governments will take a heavy military stance, but lessons from places like Nigeria's Niger Delta have taught us that you need to have a carrot and stick approach. You need to look at some of the social economic grievances that are there. You may even want to consider some sort of peace deal, as we saw in Nigeria with the amnesty program in the Niger Delta.
And, you know, we've talked about the curse of natural resources, for example, many times on our air on CNN International. How much of the violence is being fueled by, I mean, you know all about Nigeria's Niger Delta situation, but how much of the violence in Mozambique is being fueled by people just fearing and being disillusioned by the fact that they know, or they believe they know, that the money that comes into this country from natural gas is not going to trickle down to the people who need it most?
Interesting question, but Zain, you know, frankly, it's probably too early to say because gas from Mozambique wasn't due to come online till 2024 when the first cargoes will be exported. And we know the government was due to earn around 100 billion in revenues. And there's a sense in which this may have happened because of some underlying political tensions. Let's not forget that Mozambique has historically had a problem with local insurgencies and rebellion. And we're now hearing about links to international terrorist groups such as ISIS. So there is a mix of factors here that could fuel a conflict, which may then be exacerbated by local perception that natural resources, revenues, and proceeds will not get to the right parts of the economy and lead to sustainable economic development. I think the government has a lot of work to do to ensure that that is not the prevailing perception, but over and beyond that is the situation at hand, which is the danger of an escalating insurgency that could have wider regional economic and political repercussions.
All right, Rolake Akinkugbe-Filani, live for us there. Always good to see you. Thank you so much for being on the program. Still to come here.